Mirza Asadullah Baig Khan was an Indian poet. He was born in Agra on 27 December 1797. Known commonly as Ghalib, which means dominant, the pen name certainly fit his character and achievements. He is famous for his poetry in Urdu. His letters are regarded as foundational for easy and popular Urdu that we know of as today. He refrained from all formalities in letter writing, which made his letters feel like a conversation. His letters were quirky to say the least. He'd refer to himself in third person. Sometimes even the recipient would be referred to in third person, which would cause the recipient to believe there's someone else he's referring to. Confused? Well, yes, exactly. Numerous commentaries on his ghazal compilations have been written by Urdu scholars. He was bright and sharp, composing poetry at the age of 11. Even though he is famous for his Urdu work, he always preferred his Persian poetry with pride and considered it much more colorful. Which is even more impressive considering that he learnt the foundations of Persian through Abd Samad, a noted scholar who visited Agra for 2 years when Ghalib was 14. Ghalib became his pupil and Samad spent the time in his home. His grandfather came to India from Samarkand as a military adventurer. He had 2 known sons, Ghalib's father Abdullah Baig Khan and his uncle Nasrullah Baig Khan. His ancestry was a source of pride for him. It can be seen in his writings. Ghalib, I'm from the holy soil of Turan. In fullness, I am 10 times greater than the moon. Ghalib was hardly 4 when his father died. He was shot and killed by a bullet while dealing with some rebels of Raja Bakator Singh. His uncle took him and his family in his care. He was given some schooling and tuition by Sheikh Mazam, who was one of the celebrated teachers of Agra. His grounding in the traditional sciences taught then, logic, astronomy, medicine, and metaphysics was thorough. He was a comely youth and an attractive young man. These were times of turbulence in India. The British were in a bit of power struggle with the locals. In 1808, Ghalib's uncle, Nasrullah, had risen to become the commander of Agra Fort. But he surrendered to the British, which turned out to be advantageous. Unfortunately, just not for himself, as he died soon after by falling from an elephant's back. Nasrullah's dependents were granted pension, of which 9-year-old Ghalib was one. On 8 August 1810, a few months short of 13 years of age, Ghalib was married to Amra Begum, daughter of Noah Bilahi Baig Khan. Later, he rented a haveli in the heart of Delhi, not far from Chandni Chowk. Through his father-in-law, with whom he possibly stayed for a while on arrival, he got introduced to the nobility and elite. Ghalib's early years in Delhi were not without their compensations. His reputation as a poet was undisputed and was rapidly growing. He was accepted as a member of the feudal elite and, within it, enjoyed a lovable notoriety that at once set him apart from others. He had good friends, drank good wine, enjoyed regular gambling sessions, and frequented the salons of courtesans. He considered himself a member of the aristocracy and consciously adopted a matching style. He never went out except in a palanquin. He only visited those who came to him, and never those that didn't. There was only one emerging problem: his increasing insolvency. Ghalib's only steady monthly income was 62.5 rupees. This was his share of the hereditary pension that the British had agreed to pay the dependents of Nasrullah Baig Khan. Given the cost of living in those days, it was not an insignificant amount. The British defined poverty as a net household income of less than 3 rupees per month. Not surprisingly, Ghalib could afford to keep and maintain 4 servants. But it was woefully inadequate to sustain the standard of living he chose to adopt. His tastes were expensive, French wine and gambling. At the age of 40, he was facing financial difficulties. Ghalib now had to think about earning a living, like having some work. So naturally, he went to Calcutta to complain to the governor instead. He began to investigate his share of the pension granted by the British. Ghalib came to the conclusion that Ahmad Baig Khan, who dispersed it, had deliberately deprived him of his rightful share by fraudulently having Ghalib's share reduced to 5,000 rupees from the designated 10,000 rupees. Ahmad Baig Khan had included claimants such as Khawaja Haji, who bore no relationship to Ghalib's uncle. His stay in Calcutta did not help his case much. The British were at this point the de facto rulers and did not want to deal with or entertain the local feudal structure. In fact, they were growing increasingly intolerant even to the Mughal king's Darbar's customs. Ghalib kept fighting and being dismissed for many years. During his stay, some people criticized his Persian compositions and backed up their criticism by the quotations from Kato, who was a famous Indian Persian poet. Ghalib did not fancy criticism much or thought of it as something to be used for improvement. He simply used his trump card by revealing, "I do not recognize any authority except that of the mother tongue writers." So in short, Ghalib meant that since he was an Indian, his opinions were as valuable as a Reddit mod, despite he himself being an Indian Persian speaker. He was not temperamentally suited to exchanges and got so upset that he wrote a long poem remarking on the unkindness of people. "I and my Creator know that my last breath is on my lips. If you do not show kindness, you should at least not show cruelty." Whether or not this poem impressed his critics in any way is unknown. He was intolerant to criticism only because he had a firm belief in his poetry, and of only a few people being capable enough to judge it. In the aftermath of the pension case, Ghalib kept increasingly to his home. His wife was an extremely religious lady, and certainly not the type to look kindly upon his unorthodox style of living and frequent misdeeds. They stood in stark contrast, for Ghalib was the other extreme in his indifference to religious observances. It is for this reason that she even kept her eating and drinking utensils separate from her husband's. References in Ghalib's letters to the institution of marriage would make it appear that he considered it an unredeemed burden. However, that's not entirely true. Ghalib would always find time, at some point in the day, to be with her, and she, on her part, never failed in concerning herself with his needs. With the opening of the Delhi College, Ghalib in fact was offered the professorship in Persian in 1842. Thompson, secretary to the government of India, asked him to come for an interview. When Ghalib alighted from the palanquin, he expected Thompson to come outside to receive him. This was customary courtesy when a member of the nobility was calling. Thompson did not do so because he saw no reason to follow the custom, as Ghalib was coming as an applicant for a job. Ghalib left the scene by telling Thompson that he had expected that the job would add to his prestige, not detract from it. Ghalib needed the money, but not at the cost of his image. A poet of renown was supposed to be supported by royal patronage and the discerning among the rich. Work is for peasants, obviously. His wit and humor was unquestionable. He was very fond of mangoes. One day his close friend was sitting by Ghalib's house. A donkey passed by some mango skins and left them alone after sniffing the skins. His friend, who did not like mangoes, remarked, "Look, even donkeys did not like mangoes." To which Ghalib immediately replied, "Of course, donkeys won't like them," implying that his friend was on the level of a donkey for not liking them. Once, a man made an attack on wine by commenting, "The prayers of a person who drinks are not answered." Ghalib's reply was, "If you've already got wine, what else would you be praying for?" After Zok's death, Ghalib was appointed as the tutor in poetry of the emperor in 1854. He was displeased for not being the first choice for the job, but all of this would soon become irrelevant in 1857. At the end of Ramzan, the king once asked Ghalib about how many fasts he had kept. Without batting an eyelid, and with an absolutely straight face, Ghalib replied, "My lord, I did not keep one." This could mean he had failed to keep only one, or failed to keep a single one. He had troubles with the law for gambling. In 1847, he was sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment with hard labor and a fine of 200 rupees. He was released after 3 months in prison and did not have to perform hard labor. He was allowed to eat food sent from home, wear his own clothes, and receive visitors. Probably he was confident that the matter would be contained. After all, he was a distinguished member of the nobility. His loss of this confidence affected his feelings. He wrote during this time, "It is my desire no longer to stay in this world, and if I must stay, then not to stay in India. There is Rum, there is Egypt, there is Iran, there is Baghdad. But these two I pass by. The Kaaba itself is the sanctuary of the free. I await the day when I shall gain release from this bondage of wretchedness, which wears away my soul more than the bondage I have undergone could do, and shall set my face towards the wilderness, not caring where I go." In 1857, there was an uprising in India against the British. Delhi was conquered, but when the British took the city back, it was looted and anyone remotely suspected of conspiracy was punished. Ghalib had all of his valuables lost. He lost his job for the now exiled emperor and his pension. It was a difficult time, and not many Muslims were left in the city. The last 10 years of his life were particularly difficult. His friends were all gone, and there was no one of his contemporaries left to appreciate his poetry. Later in his life, illnesses started to inconvenience him, and he began to long for death. He died on 15th of February, 1869. He was a great person who will remain in the history books for his literary work.